Hello, this is Cynthia Sue Larson with RealityShifters.com, talking with you today about finding the optimal path forward amidst fifth generational warfare and cataclysmic change. So that may seem contradictory, but a lot of us are noticing that in these uncertain times, there's a lot going on. In fact, I love to ask focusing questions like how good can it get? So of course that's going to be the perspective today. And my real question is, how can we stay positive when it seems like the world literally might be falling apart? Geological evidence shows cycles of cataclysmic polar shifts, magnetic field changes, and weather changes, all suggesting that we might be at the brink of another such change, while world governments appear to be engaged in a war of information and perception. So I'm going to break that down a little bit today and then end up with that radical optimism that I love so much. So basically, when we look at all of these different cycles of ancient history, and I've got some books to show today. You might read a book like this one, it's Earth Under Fire. I do recommend it if you're interested in what's happened historically. Paul LaViolette has passed away now, and I didn't get to meet him, but he does talk about humanity's survival of the Ice Age and some of the stories that match from continent to continent, culture to culture, all going back showing that there have been cataclysms in the past that mankind has dealt with. Now, if you've followed my work for any length of time, you probably know that I've talked at some length occasionally about the Hopi and other native indigenous peoples with their wisdom that goes back thousands and thousands of years, where they recommend maintaining a certain positive attitude and philosophy and approach to life as we go through one of these cataclysmic times. They would call what we're going through the end of the fourth world, moving into the fifth. And anyway, if you check out I've got a blog post article about this, and that lists all the references. So if you're reading this, then you can see where to click to read all of the original sources that I'm talking about, including the article that I wrote for Parabola magazine called Comes True Being Hoped For. And that's really where I talk about the moving from that fourth world to the fifth and what happened at each juncture, what have we faced, what are the optimal ways to think about it. We'll be exploring that today a little bit. But going back to what's been discovered recently, scientists are confirming something is going on. What we've seen recently, just in research done in the last couple of years, is that there's evidence showing that the magnetic field of the Earth has definitely shifted, and they can tell by looking at underwater, bottom of the ocean, volcanic surges where magma bubbles up from the hot surface it bubbles up onto basically a tectonic plate. It's the bottom of the ocean is a tectonic plate by definition. It's part of the 36 miles of that outer crust that sits on top of the mantle and those really hot internal layers of the Earth. And so what's visible at the bottom of the ocean are two types of evidence. One consists of the dead bodies of these little tiny plankton and organisms that cluster and aggregate around the equator, the midsection. The equator is the equatorial range, and it's designated, it's always at a tilt, kind of like a hula girl or something, someone who's swaying their hips and doing the hula hoop or the hula dance. It looks like that. It's that slightly tilted equatorial plane. The tilt on the Earth is between the north and south poles. It's not up and down exactly, it's tilted. And so the equator is kind of going around like that. And what's happening, and the reason that we've got this thick cluster of organisms at the bottom of the ocean to show us where the equator has been, is because these little tiny organisms, they feed at the equatorial regions, because those are the rich regions where the currents of water are always, as there's centripetal pull, there's a force that goes around as the Earth is spinning. And what's happening is it's basically collecting movement, it's stimulating the movement of all of the currents of the ocean. So in the northern hemisphere, there's water movement going north. In the south, water is moving to the south. That leaves kind of what could be called a bit of a vacuum at the equator, but that's filled in because at the equator, water rises up from the floor of the ocean and comes up to the top. When it does that, it's bringing the rich nutrients from the bottom of the floor up to the top, and that's how all these little organisms are thriving. So what's happening? How can we tell for sure that this has shifted? We're able to see, just like you can see the Milky Way in the night sky, especially if you're down in the southern hemisphere, at the bottom of the ocean, we get this accretion, this accumulation of all these little microorganisms, tiny plankton and so forth. Their dead bodies accumulate where the equator used to be. So then they can tell for sure, what's going on in terms of, is the equatorial region, has it always been the same? And no, it has not. So that is really something interesting, and it's part of what's known as the, trying to find where my notes, I printed this out. There's a lot going on. So to refresh and review, the Coriolis forces with the ocean currents have contributed to bringing those little microorganisms to a certain place. That's how we know for sure that when we look at the bottom of the ocean with deep drilling tools and so forth, we can determine where the equator used to be. And it's not exactly where you'd expect it to be based on the tectonic plate movement. It's actually a little bit different. And that makes things really interesting. And that combined with the fact, as I mentioned earlier, about the magnetic information from the volcanoes that are bubbling up at the bottom of the ocean floor, when that lava cools like it does underwater, it cools showing a little imprint of where the north and south magnetic poles used to be. All of this information together can then create a picture for us of when and where these north poles and south poles of the Earth. There are two sets of poles. Hope it's not too confusing. There's the actual tilt axis of the way that the Earth is spinning, and that's the geological, geographic poles. And then there are the electric poles, the electromagnetic poles, and those ones sort of dance and move, so they're roughly around where the tilt, the geographic poles are. And what's been happening recently is that those poles, we're seeing them shifting. They've been moving faster and faster. So there's been this movement that's happened, and they're kind of doing what's called true polar wander. And there's a paper that I referenced showing all of this if you want to see what's going on with that. And the time frame that we're talking about here is sometime between 48 and 12 million years ago. The Earth's spin axis and geographic north and south poles were in very different places than they are today. And that North Pole originally was closer to Greenland than it is today. The South Pole shifted similarly to the west. And at some point in time, this would be around 12 million years ago, the poles moved to where they are now. But they're on the move again. That's what I'm mentioning. So we're seeing some shifting happening right now. And what happens when that occurs, a lot of people, there's some controversy and discussion in that area. But it's clear that sometimes the Earth's crust, the tectonic plates, can kind of slip loose and make an adjustment. And when they do that, there can be a rapid adjustment. So some people are concerned about what could happen there and when that might occur. And so here we've got some discussions. There are a couple people talking about that. One that I've followed is he'd be a futurist, remote viewing the future, and there are several of those. I do recommend John Peterson of the Arlington Institute, and he has a monthly, well actually bi-monthly, every 2 weeks they get together. Greg Braden, Penny Kelly, Kingsley Dennis, and John Peterson get together. They talk about this. And another one that talks about this would be Stephen Schwartz, who I've interviewed on my Living the Quantum Dream podcast. And he has done some remote viewing experiments, and the results are showing that people, when they remote view the future without too much in the way of prompting, it looks like the world continues, technology continues, but they talk about something that happened around maybe 2045, the big thing that happened. They don't really specifically say what it was, and so there's some discussion and room for conjecture in that area. And then someone else that is looking toward the future and tracking solar weather is Ben Davidson, and this is his book, Weatherman's Guide to the Sun. He's got a channel on YouTube, which is Suspicious Observers, and he daily has an announcement of what's going on with space weather and solar weather. And he's expecting that there will be this kind of rapid change at some point in the future, which we might want to plan for and organize for. That does make sense. So why aren't we hearing more about these things? You might wonder, okay, if this is going on and sounds like some of these sources are pretty credible, you've probably heard of, the people I've mentioned, Greg Braden certainly, Penny Kelly, John Peterson, hopefully you've heard of them. Maybe you've heard of Kingsley Dennis, and I don't know if you've heard of Stephen Schwartz, but these people, as well as others, are definitely talking about this. Yet at the same time, it looks like there's been something of an obscurement, an obstruction, maybe sort of a glossing over or a distraction. Yes, and there probably is something that we need to consider as well. And that would be something known as fifth generation warfare. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the first 4 generations of warfare, but just to summarize quickly, the first had to do with, and this started around the 1600s, with the Treaty of Westphalia. There were tactics of line and column, and those developed to optimize efficacy of the smooth-bore musket. Second generation warfare then emerged and evolved from the first, and that included tactics of indirect fire and mass movement to work with rifled muskets, breech loaders, barbed wire, and the machine gun. Then came third generation warfare, featuring tactics of nonlinear movement, including maneuver and infiltration, developed in response to World War I weaponry and tactics. That brings us up to the 1920s. Fourth generation warfare came next. That's sometimes referred to as insurgency, which can be seen at the point where nation states lose their monopoly on war, and there's a return to a world of clashing cultures. However, it looks like we're now evolved beyond even that into something called fifth generation warfare, and I've got sources and references so you can learn all about it. I'm just basically touching on it today so we can visualize how to optimize everything in the face of all of this. Okay, so what is fifth generation warfare? That's defined as global war of ideas and narratives. Some analysts of this topic point out that the crux of fifth generation warfare is that it takes advantage of ambiguity. It thus includes characteristics such as mass cyber attacks occurring that are not attributable to any specific nation state, mass social engineering conducted sometimes on their own citizenry, an absence of us versus them with spontaneous conflict arising seemingly randomly, where things just blow up or explode and there's no explanation, and also non-state actors becoming primary belligerents, and nation states having the wrong tools for the job. So the whole thing comes off seeming like chaos. Yet at the same time, there's not much really explained as to the deep levels of coming clean with what's really happening. Instead, there's just a lot of disinformation, misinformation, and even finger pointing to claim that others are doing all of that. So there's a certain vulnerability in this generation of warfare where people's access to true information is vulnerable to manipulation via social engineering and long trusted sources of information. Essentially, layers upon layers of what some people call psyops can be running in ways designed to pit people against one another. And this can create distractions so that they don't notice some unspoken truths by leaders who might actually know what's going on. So what can we learn about all this? For that, I'd like to go back to The Art of War, which is a powerful book, and it contains a win-win kind of a tip, and this is from the author Sun Tzu. I'm just going to read a short passage from it. The passage is, when you surround an army, leave an outlet free. Do not press a desperate foe too hard. Build your opponent a golden bridge to retreat across. And I like this for a whole bunch of reasons. Number one, I love picturing success. So even if you're not clear what that looks like, just imagine how good can it get for the world, for all of us, beyond the chaos, beyond what seems to be happening now. Just imagine, if you will, how good it can get, or how good it's been for you, and that maybe that could continue in ways that all the best of everything we love the most can somehow continue in some fashion or version or evolution of what it currently is. And secondly, I love that if we assure that we're picturing this success, it really is a win-win. Instead of exacting some kind of revenge or something like that, we're actually picturing how good can it get for all of us. Can we create a world that even welcomes those who might have been perhaps mistakenly misguided to create problems? I would hope so. And I'd love to keep asking how good can it get throughout all of this process, of course. And we might even ask, how might we best plan to provide a path of retreat for those at war against us in fifth generational war? And of course, my favorite tool in the toolkit would be radical optimism, and that involves looking at everything that's happening, keeping an optimistic attitude, and really remembering the revolutionary power of radical optimism that I talked about a year ago on a YouTube video and in my blog. So that's exactly what I think we need in the years ahead. We need to keep this perspective that I'm advocating. Every time I keep asking, how good can it get? This prompts the participatory universe to provide us with answers that we genuinely do want to live the answer to. So just as we can sometimes harness mind-matter interaction to assist weather situations, if you're thinking, okay, Cynthia, what are we going to do about the cataclysm? This moving into the fifth world where the entire crust, 36-mile crust, slips loose of the mantle and just jerks suddenly in some crazy direction with a slosh and a backslosh of water that Ben Davidson talks about. What about that? Well, that is another kind of weather. That would be space weather, sun weather. So what can we do with weather? We can do a lot. This is what the indigenous wisdom keepers knew about when they would work with the earth energies, with the weather energies. And a lot of them have kind of been handing that torch, if you will, to those of us now who genuinely are working to be the best people we can be in connection at all of the levels of conscious agency that we possess with those other conscious agents that are capable of joining with us to basically ask, how good can it get for moving into this fifth world, and how good can we envision that to be? So this is weather changes. Some of you watching might feel like, hey, I've worked with that. Perfect. That's how to look at this. And if you're interested in all the sources, the ones I've talked about, the Hopi, I talk a lot about the Tunatya, the Tunatyava. These are words that mean comes true, being hoped for. This is from the Hopi. And they talk about keeping the crown chakra, the Kopavi chakra, open to retain connection to divine source, to divinity. And they also recommend at this time that we keep our hearts open so that we can stay in good relationship with ourselves, with others, with the earth, and with all the beings on it. Plants, animals, rocks, minerals, water, earth, air, spirit, everything. And so this is the key to restoring trust in basic goodness. This is the key to staying open to the divine and setting an example of our presence in this world as we maintain optimal focus by asking my favorite question. You know what it is. How good can it get? So until next time, thanks for posting any comments you've got, questions you've got. I love your ideas when you suggest something I could talk about. I hope that everything's going great for you. Send you lots of love and blessings. And of course, keep asking, how good can it get? Lots of love. Take care.